Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I'd like to thank you for joining us this afternoon to discuss something that is so important to all of us. Too many Virginians know all too well the pain and heartbreak of losing a loved one to gun violence. Last Friday marked the 14th anniversary of the Virginia Tech massacre, and that was a day that changed the Commonwealth forever. But gun violence is not just the mass shootings. It's also the child who is shot at a park by a stray bullet. It's the woman who's killed at the hands of a violent partner. It's the communities that live in fear that they could be shot doing something as simple as going to the grocery store or to the movies. And we cannot allow ourselves to become numb to these senseless acts of gun violence happening in Virginia and around our country. Last year, Virginia passed some really meaningful gun violence prevention measures in those 14 years. And things like reinstating the proven effective one gun a month law, enacting comprehensive background checks, passing a red flag law to help keep firearms out of the hands of dangerous individuals who could be a danger to themselves or to others. And as Attorney General, I have advocated for these and many other common sense gun control measures. And I've been successful at defending a number of Virginia's new gun safety laws in court against attacks from the gun lobby. But there is still so much to do to protect our communities and to keep our families and our loved ones safe from gun violence. We have a gun violence problem in this country and in this Commonwealth. But there are things that we can do to keep our communities safer, like banning high capacity magazines and bump stocks, fighting to keep untraceable ghost and 3D guns off our streets, and implementing innovative campaigns to reduce gun violence in our community. Ending gun violence in Virginia will take a comprehensive approach, but it's one that I am absolutely dedicated to and committed to. And we've got a great panel lined up for this discussion. And I'd like to take a moment first to introduce the members of our panel, and then we'll get we'll move forward with the discussion. So first is my friend, Gloria Haas. She is the Senior Director of Advocacy for the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. She's been a fierce advocate for gun violence prevention efforts in Virginia. After her daughter was injured in the Virginia Tech massacre, Lori really dedicated herself to changing policy and advancing legislation and community and grassroots efforts to really reduce gun violence in Virginia and across the country. We're also joined by Gloria Pan. Gloria is the Vice President of Member Engagement, Campaign Innovations, and Gun Control for Moms Rising. And through her work with Moms Rising, Gloria focuses on the strategic combination of powerful messaging, grassroots organizing, and technology and data to engage folks and move issues forward. We are also joined by Andy Parker. Andy knows personally the impact of gun violence too well. His daughter, Allison Parker, was shot and killed live on television on August 26, 2015, when she was reporting live for a TV station at Smith Mountain Lake. Following the death of his daughter, Andy became a national spokesperson advocating for common sense gun control to keep firearms out of the hands of dangerous people. We're also joined by Lieutenant Spencer Cochran. Lieutenant Cochran came to the Richmond Police Department last summer after spending nearly 32 years with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. Lieutenant Cochran came to Richmond to focus on community engagement and in the city and build relationships between law enforcement and the community they serve. We also have my friend Shannon Taylor. Shannon has served as a Commonwealth's attorney for Henrico since 2012. She has been a fierce advocate for common sense gun control throughout her career, and she's been a trusted advisor and friend to me and to those of us in the Attorney General's office. We are also joined by Carol Adams. Carol has worked in law enforcement for almost 30 years. She spent 7 in the Richmond Sheriff's Department before joining the Richmond Police Department. And following a tragic event in her own life, Carol founded the Carol Adams Foundation with the mission to provide emergency assistance to women and children who are the victims of domestic violence. And finally, we're joined by Pastor Emmanuel Harris. Pastor Harris is the president of the Baptist Ministers Conference of Richmond and vicinity. Throughout his work as a pastor and as the president of the Baptist Ministers Conference, Dr. Harris focuses on the importance of building and strengthening communities and the important role that churches play in that mission. So as you can tell, we've got a great panel. And so let's go ahead and just get started with the conversation. I'd like to start off with the issue of ghost guns and how big of a concern are ghost guns? Lieutenant Cochran?
Hello. Yeah, so a ghost gun is a gun with no recognizable serial number. Okay, so you can order parts for a gun, put that gun together, and it's not traceable. Issue that in law enforcement have is that once used in a crime, there's no way to put that gun back to a certain person with no kind of traceable number. We have been fortunate in Virginia, in Richmond, not in Virginia, but in Richmond, that we don't see a lot of them, but they are concerning. We had 2 last year. One involved in shooting of a police officer, actually. That was a ghost gun. We have 1 so far this year. So again, the issue with law enforcement is that there's no way that we can trace those guns back to a specific individual, and they're not regulated right now because it's home for personal use. So you can order it, have it in your home, and nothing wrong with that. But again, no serial number, no way we can trace it back to an individual. If it's used in a criminal act, it basically it's a no-win for law enforcement.
Yeah, and I think even in some instances, a background check may not even be required in order to order the parts.
It's not. I mean, now the same individual that illegally not allowed to possess a gun, that still falls into play. So if you're a convicted felon, you can't have a gun. You still can't have that gun either. But you can order it and get it. Just that we never know about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Lori, what about things like? Or would you like to add something?
I was going to comment. 2 General Assembly members went to a gun show just last month in March. They bought the parts, no questions asked, no background checks, and went home and assembled fully, functioning metal-made firearms. And that's the problem. And Lieutenant Cochran is correct. As Virginia begins to regulate the unregulated market, we're requiring background checks. We're requiring the reporting of lost and stolen. Criminals will look for other sources for crime guns, and this is one of them. And we anticipate sales of unfinished receivers and unserialized firearms to be rising. The city of Baltimore has seen a 400% increase in ghost guns found at crime scenes. And we'd like to get ahead of it. So thank you to you, Attorney General, for bringing this forward. We need to get in front of this. Yeah.
Well, what about other types of parts, Lori? Things like high-capacity magazines, silencers, high-powered, easy-to-handle weapons. How are these contributing to the deadliness of gun violence?
Anytime you have firearms and firearms accessories that aren't regulated, again, they just create, the market for criminals. They find those in resources. High-capacity magazines are a problem. They can be outfitted on handguns as well as semi-automatic assault-style rifles. The weaponry used in the Virginia Tech massacre were Glocks, but they were outfitted with 15-round magazines. It's the reason he could spray into a classroom and do the damage he did. These must be better regulated. They must require a background check. And there's reason to think that requiring a background check on all of these parts and or banning them or limiting them in some way would make a lot of sense.
Shannon, how are these contributing to the deadliness of gun violence?
Well, first of all, you have to look at the purpose of what these accessories, we're going to call them, are being utilized for. And just this morning, there was a story on NPR about Congressman Good, or the new congressman there in the 5th, who is introducing a federal law and actually has the backing of 9 other Republican congressmen to say that a silencer need not be regulated, need not to have a background check. And the whole idea being, well, if you have the gun lawfully, you should be able to go ahead and purchase this accessory lawfully. Well, that's very short-sighted, because clearly something could happen between someone lawfully purchasing a gun and then they become a prohibited person, and you would never know that they would be acquiring a silencer. And again, let's ask ourselves, what is the purpose of the high capacity magazine? What is the purpose of the silencer? And why should we not, for the safety of citizens, not want to regulate that, to understand how many of these items are out there and who is purchasing them? And it's, and regretfully, this is not about the right to bear arms. These are accessories that make this what we keep talking about as the subject of the Second Amendment, taking what is a lawful implement, a gun, and putting onto it accessories, implementations that make it a significantly much more dangerous object than the intent of the original purpose.
And Major Cochran, and I apologize if I called you Lieutenant and you're a Major, but do you have anything to add to how these accessories contribute to the lethality of gun violence?
No, I mean, of course, the accessibility and having that, it could, extremely increase the level of violence or the number of actually victims. Again, we're, in the city of Richmond, we haven't seen a lot of that kind of activity. More so of this, there's so many weapons are being left unsecure in so many vehicles. That we see. I mean, it's so many. It's so callous with the weapon that then, we get so many every day that are left in cars, on the seat, but the vehicle's not locked. They're leaving to go in the store, they're leaving to go home, they're leaving to go to, an event. But again, that's the accessibility. If you can open the door, reach under your seat and grab a gun and walk away with it. That's the issue that I see is very prevalent and a bigger issue right there, just the availability and this being not secure.
So, we have started to make some real progress in Virginia with some new gun safety laws, things like the one handgun a month law that had been proven effective, being reinstated, expanded background checks, a red flag law. But there are a lot of ways that we can make these laws stronger, or we can pass additional laws that we need in order to protect communities. Lori, what do you see as the priorities going forward?
Well, we have one of our priorities is to address the age limitation that is not in Virginia law, but is in federal law, and the conflict that your office has seen, Attorney General, with a lawsuit. Persons under the age of 21 by federal law are prohibited from purchasing firearms. That is not the case in Virginia. We need to address that. Persons, young men of color, between the ages of 18 and 24 are at very high risk of homicide, firearm homicide. It's the number one killer in those age groups. So we need to help. We need to do something about that. We need to look at the open and concealed carry of firearms in public. Is it making us safer? Is it not? Especially when it comes to semi-automatic assault style rifles being paraded up and down our streets and at protests and other places. Inside this line, you're at an event, perhaps it's regulated, perhaps you're not allowed to carry, but outside, across the street on the sidewalk, you're allowed to have a semi-automatic, rifle at your fingertips. I find it uncalled for. I think at a minimum, we need to address the public carry of firearms, and in particular, semi-automatic assault style firearms. We need to continue many of our regulations, and we need to look at our removal laws. We can have a prohibition, as an example, on a person convicted of certain domestic violence misdemeanors. Is there wraparound mechanisms either by the courts or the law enforcement agencies to make certain that the person is in fact disarmed? So we have a lot more we can do.
And, I think there's a lot more that Congress needs to do as well. I don't think Virginia should wait around for Congress because we could be waiting a long time. But are there some of these policies and laws that are best adopted at a federal level, or what additional federal protections do you think are needed? And I'll just toss it out to anybody. Well,
unfortunately, I think one of the things that we just saw happen with there's so many shootings, I can't even remember which one happened where. But what just happened at the FedEx in I think that was Wisconsin, where that young person who was, I think, 19 years old, who had been visited by the federal law enforcement agency because of concerns that his mother had. This is supposed to be what we talk about with the red flag law. But yet somehow, even though on that particular day, what that firearm was taken, that gentleman was still allowed to go purchase firearms that were then used in the killing at the warehouse. And Lori, I just really want to recognize the great work her nonprofit does, because she actually knows what that data is, where she's be able to articulate the reasoning for the legislation, because we aren't treating gun violence as the public health crisis that it is, which I know, Attorney General, you have said time and time again, which is definitely what everyone on this panel has said time and time again. But we somehow missed something there, and I'm not really sure how. But I know that Lori and Andy will be working hard to see if we can fix that next time.
So perhaps you bring it up, at the federal level, and I know, Mr. Attorney General, you've done this at the state level, but we have got to address hate crimes. It is unacceptable. It is unreasonable that we're arming hate, and it's happening far too much across this country. And I'm sure Gloria can share a little bit more about that in her work.
It is a very complicated issue, and it reaches all the way back to the history of our country. We have structural racism. We have a culture of gun ownership that is based on white supremacy, and to get a handle on our gun violence epidemic, whatever frame you want to look at it, we have to look at all of that in conjunction with actually creating the laws that's going to stop gun violence. And I can talk a little bit more about that later.
Well, I do think the rise of anti-Asian hate is a serious concern for me. It's a serious concern for many Virginians. Gloria, since you touched on it in a moment, you started to touch on it, but could you just go ahead and elaborate a little bit more about how big of a concern is it within the community, and how does the ready access to guns and firearms compound that fear?
Okay, so at Moms Rising, I lead the campaign to stop gun violence. And at Moms Rising, we are multi-issue and we are intersectional. And, we were very concerned that the divisiveness of the Trump era from his very first day in office would unleash violence against non-white, non-Christian communities. And that's exactly what we saw, right? So in 2018, we saw the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh that targeted people of the Jewish faith. And then in 2019, we saw the El Paso Walmart shooting, which targeted Latino Americans. And now, most recently, we saw the Atlanta shooting. 6 out of the 8 victims there were Asian American women. And then last week, the Indianapolis shooting, 4 of the 8 victims were Sikh. We can thank Donald Trump for much of this, but again, like I said, this is all about white supremacy, and this reaches all the way back to the founding of our country. So it's important to understand that in regard to the Asian American community, in times of national crisis, the impulse has been to scapegoat us as being non-American, not foreign or other. And these recent mass shootings are not isolated incidents. From the very beginning, we have a long history in America against the Asian American community, starting from the Chinese Exclusion Act, the internment of Japanese Americans, and then most recently even the Muslim ban, because many Asian Americans are Muslim. So here in Virginia, the Asian American community is one of our fastest growing communities. We are 7% of the population, the vast majority being here in Northern Virginia. Our community is frankly bewildered, and we are scared. And not only do we have to worry about violence against us from outside our community, but we also have to worry about violence within our community, because the pandemic has brought record gun sales. And unfortunately, there is a surge in gun purchases from the Asian American community. And, many of us are new Americans. We are here building lives and learning how to be American. and we don't understand the dangers of actually bringing a gun into our homes and how that actually creates the chance that we will be harmed. Perhaps most troublingly, like our community is increasingly vulnerable to right-wing messaging around the issue of safety, and that, of course, can have impacts on our elections.
And
Let's go ahead.
I was going to say you're exactly right. I think we can attribute a lot of the rise in anti-Asian hate over the last year to the rhetoric, the dangerous and irresponsible rhetoric of our former president, but it has existed for a long time in this country. And there is a common thread that connects the anti-Asian hate that has existed in this country for a long time to other vulnerable groups and minority groups. And that common thread is white supremacy, and it has been with us for 4 centuries, and it has got to stop. It's got to stop. Well, another area of concern, especially when connected with firearms, is domestic violence. And Carol, can you talk a little bit about the connection between gun violence and domestic violence, and how big of a factor is the presence of a gun in contributing to harm or even homicide in domestic violence?
Wow. Yes, this is a deadly intersection. You know, guns and intimate partner violence impacting all women, and a disproportionate impact to Black Americans, Indian, Alaskan, Native, and Hispanic women, and the LGBT community, which is most often left out, and communities with people with disabilities. They suffer at high vulnerability to severe forms of relationship abuse. And we know that when a gun is brought into the equation, that heightens it 5 times where homicide is more than likely to occur. And, you know, it is such a factor that, you know, when we talk about this, that there's not a lot of research been done. So a lot of it goes unreported because of the individuals who this crimes is being perpetrated upon. And so it's important for us to understand that power of control and that emotional abuse that's very often articulated, whereas people can understand the severity of what's actually happening behind those closed doors with those victims of violence.
And Shannon or Lori, what are your thoughts about the connection between the ready access to firearms and the lethality of domestic violence?
It's a tragedy, and it's a notable problem. It's one we've tried to address, you know, via policy. But, you know, I think about one of the themes that keeps coming back, you know, firearms don't make you safer. There is little to no situations where firearms make you safer. I understand law enforcement and their training and their ability to carry a firearm and understand how to use it, but sadly they use them inappropriately too, and they're deadly and they're lethal. Often, though, also in domestic violence situations, firearms are used for intimidation and threat. And those are big problems in too many homes and too many households and too many circumstances. You know, thank God the women are alive, but they're you know, threatened and intimidated into behaviors that are not of their own volition. You know, firearms are used inappropriately and exaggeratedly and in too many situations. And as Carol noted, in a domestic violence situation, when there's a firearm present, either the woman could own it or the man, but when a firearm is present, that woman, typically a woman, but the victim is 5 times at a higher risk of being killed. It's just unacceptable. We have to do a better job. And that's what I alluded to, that we would be looking at, you know, removal and disarming. You can have the prohibition, but you have to have a mechanism and a process where you make certain that prohibited people do not, in fact, possess their firearms.
And I was just going to, I know that Gloria wanted to share some thoughts. The only thing I was going to add to what Lori had to say was just about what we know is going on with this pandemic. I mean, COVID has, I don't think we're really going to know the impact that this pandemic has had on our society. But what we do know is that the rate of domestic violence is skyrocketing. We've got women who have no place to go. There's no, that we can't like remove the offender because
Right.
where are they going to go? And we do know that from the documentation from the hospitals, and I know Carol is intimately familiar with this as well, is that the seriousness of the injuries that these women are now coming to the hospital with after having been the victim of domestic violence are becoming more serious. And that is, like Lori said, it is a recipe for disaster. And Gloria, I'm sorry.
No, not at all. I also wanted to add that for Asian American communities and immigrant communities, domestic violence is particularly troubling because these are insulated communities, and there's strong misogyny, as in many other communities within our communities, and women in our communities don't have access to whatever protections that the law provides because of language and culture. So whatever we can do to do the organizing and the outreach and to provide the language appropriate resources would be really, really important.
And, I think getting back to something that Shannon had mentioned about the shooting in Indiana, where the red flag law they have there did not result in an adjudication that this individual needed to be separated from other weapons or prevent him from purchasing others. Now that Virginia has our law, we're going to have to work especially hard to make sure that it's implemented in the right way and make sure that, as we learn from experiences around the country, that we're looking to make sure that the law that we passed is as strong and effective as it needs to be. Well, Andy, turning a moment a little bit to how we can support those who have faced the pain of losing someone personally by gun violence. What can we do to support families like yours? And can you talk about the change in conversation that you've seen even in just the last few years when it comes to gun violence prevention?
Sorry about that. There we go. I have seen since Allison was killed, it is like night and day. The landscape looks completely different than it did 5 years ago. And the reason that it looks different is because we've had Democrats elected to the the Democrats have taken over the Democrats have taken over the General Assembly, and that means that we have been able to get good gun laws passed. Now, my concern is that, and you alluded to it earlier, that we have to make sure that people don't get numb to this issue. And I think that it's probably very easy to do because, it's happening with such frequency. I think people are starting to become numb to it, but we can't allow that to happen. And we have that tenuous majority of Democrats that know what we need to do and be able to pass the initiatives that you guys have talked about. And the way that these initiatives are not going to succeed are if people don't get out to vote. That's the key deal. People have to get out to vote because the cult that elected a nut job like Bob Good, they're going to be lined up and ready to vote this November. Then if there was an election for dog catcher every week, these people would be out there. So we have to make sure that people vote so that we can get this stuff done. And to your point earlier, Mark, at a federal level, what we did in Virginia needs to be copied. And I think Senator Warner and Kane are introducing legislation that would share the Virginia way with the rest of the country and the rest of the rest of Congress. But like you said, I don't think we can wait for that. We've got to do this. We got to keep going and do the things that we need to do. Ban assault weapons, ban high capacity magazines, and have people get out and vote.
Well, it has definitely been on the ballot in the last several elections in Virginia. Voters just will not accept the status quo any longer because it is unacceptable that so many people are killed by guns every single year in the country and in our Commonwealth. And it's also thanks to the advocacy of people like Gloria who've been really out there tirelessly, for 14 years, working to advocate for change.
Well, it has been a long time, but we are making progress, and we're making progress because of, if we can't change your minds, we're going to change your seat. And if you're not with us, you're not going to be reelected. And, it's been important, and we've gotten some of these policies done. But equally as important is we're seeing resources and support and acknowledgement for the community work that's going on day in and day out across Virginia. And what I'm working on, you said, what are you looking at next year? One of the things I'm working on right now is to figure out ways to fund and find the resources so that we can continue the community work that needs to be done. We can raise the level of interest and, perhaps look at an Office of Gun Violence Prevention at the state level. Help us with those best practices. Help us with that data that the Commonwealth Attorney Shannon Taylor mentioned. There's a lot more we can do.
Well, Pastor Harris, you've been kind of quiet, taking it all in. Tell us about the role that the faith community can play to prevent gun violence.
The faith community is involved in every step of this. So, of course, being proactive is key. You talked about domestic violence. Often pastors know who's being abused in their churches, especially if you had extra training. There are warning signs that someone is in an abusive relationship. And being proactive in really addressing the root cause of issues is just so important. When I say the root cause of issues, I mean, like, even when you look at domestic violence and you look at the root cause, power and control, the abuser often is dealing with insecurity and fear that he needs individual therapy for. And I say he because 7-to-1 is more men over women than women over men from the data and from what I've experienced in 30 years of ministry. And so if you get to the root cause of therapy and mental health, then you can alleviate some of this. Now, policy is certainly important. If someone's abusive, they don't need guns. If someone is dealing with an emotional crisis, they don't need guns. So I'm not trying to dismiss policy, but I am saying that with the faith community, we have to hit it all. We have to start very young with children, teaching them conflict resolution. Carol alluded to when you throw a gun into an equation, teaching people how to talk things out, how to resolve conflict without throwing fists. Because if you solve conflict by throwing fists, eventually you'll turn 18 and that punch is going to cost you money in jail time. So, just starting very early in life, saying, look, there are other ways to go about this. And if you look at the root cause often of some of this activity, you can't ignore education. You can't ignore poverty. Because often if you had a great job opportunity, you wouldn't want to be involved in illegal activity. But you feel that I have to do this. If you look at the number one reason that people join gangs is protection. I feel that I have to protect myself, so I'm going to affiliate myself with this gang, and now I'm big and bad. But if you catch a lot of these individuals individually, they're not these tough individuals who you make them out to be. They're just normal people. But I feel like I need to protect myself somehow. So the church is often, the pastor's often on the front line when it comes to, hey, how can we make lives better for everybody? And Lori already alluded to it. The number one cause of death in African American males, 18, I believe, is 30 or something, is gun violence. So that's, and the number one victim of gun violence is white males from suicide. So we see it all. I see people who kill themselves in suicide. I see people who, get involved in lifestyles and end up getting killed. So we have to address the root causes: mental health, mental wellness, having churches go through mental health first aid, these type of resources have to be almost mandatory in the community, and we really have to take a proactive approach. I'd much rather minister before a funeral or without a funeral than to minister during a funeral. Of course, those situations occur where I have to minister during the funeral, but I'd much rather prevent it so it doesn't get to that point.
Yeah, I was if I could add it to, I mean, Pastor Harris is spot on. I know we're talking a lot about laws that we have been enacting and what can we enact, but this is not just about creating laws. This is really getting into the foundation of society. And I mean, there was the article today, or I guess yesterday in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, highlighting the crimes that I know Major Cochran knows all too well, but also not just looking at the crimes, but then looking at the age of some of the kids. And one of those little babies was a Henrico High School kid who was now a City of Richmond statistic. And I cannot emphasize enough about how we have got to find the funding for mental health. We have got to figure out how to do something differently with the education. Again, this is going to be another issue where COVID has wrecked some of these kids, and we got to figure out how we're going to find them and get them back together. But the other component to this is, I was thinking about this earlier today, is I know when we talk about violence and we talk about, people breaking the law, that there is this concept of, accepting responsibility for one's actions. But you are going to do nothing for that 19-year-old young man who is going to sit in the Department of Corrections for 3 to 5 years when he's got nothing that's going to help him be a better person when he leaves that institution differently than he came in there. And I have also been on these calls about individuals who have been in the DOC during this past year where they've had no access to vocational training, had no access to the community college system, have not had the ability to make themselves a better person, engaging in counseling. Like, punishment doesn't mean that you just sit there without having any idea or any infrastructure to make you to understand, just like Pastor Harris said, why did I engage in this conflict resolution in this manner? What trauma do I have? And Carol Adams, I know, can talk about this. The trauma that these people, the majority of these individuals coming into our criminal justice system had at a young age, or even just something that happened recently. So it is so multifaceted that I know, Attorney General Herring, that you are going to help and push that as well, because you've got great funding grant programs as well in your office that you've been using in such a wonderful fashion. But I think we can all figure out some new and inventive ways to address the problem.
And may I share some stats that I did earlier? When we look at the dynamics in Shannon, when you're talking about the children, it says every month an average of 53 women are shot and killed by an intimate partner, and nearly 1 million women alive today have reported being shot or being shot at by their partner, and 4.5 women have been reported threatened with a gun by intimate partners. So most of the time when we look at this equation, we're just looking at the perpetrator and the victim. We do not include those kids, and those kids are experiencing that vicarious trauma, and they're victims also. And so if that's the environment that I grew up in, and that conflict resolution did not occur inside my household, and like Pastor's talking about the mental health, the overall well-being, and when we look at COVID, we say the numbers are up, but I think that the numbers are showing true now, because people are hostages inside those homes, and the perpetrator can't go off to work, or the mother can't go off to work. And so now it's just becoming more volatile, and the people are pleading and crying for help. And so that's what we need to address, and we need to put these things in place, and to understand that domestic violence is real. It impacts us all to some degree, some way, shape, or form, in all communities. And so that's what we really got to look at. And it goes back to the household and to that family, and understanding the dynamics of where individuals are coming from, because we cannot expect one thing. And if that person, the foundation, we have unrealistic expectations because we're looking at things from our own vantage point and not from the vantage point of the individual that we're working with.
Yeah, and it is so refreshing to have a partner in the White House who we can work with on these issues. And I was so pleased with the president's recent announcement about some of the first steps that he's taking to address gun violence. And one of them is to include significant new funding for evidence-based gun violence interruption. And I am here to tell you these programs work. And Carol, you were talking about how we tend to look at domestic violence situations as the perpetrator and usually the woman victim, but that there are also other people in the family, others in the neighborhood who are impacted by it as well. And that is exactly why it is so important to have trained people go in and interrupt that cycle of violence, because if you are somehow impacted by violence, especially gun violence, whether it is as a victim, as a witness, as somebody who's been impacted in other ways, you are at very high risk of violence again, either as a victim or even as a perpetrator, unless that cycle is interrupted. And that's what violence interruption programs do. The individuals who do this work are trained. They go in and they work with the community when there's been violence and make sure that, that risk of violence doesn't happen. And we had a program here in Richmond. We had the funding to run it for 9 months. It was called Respect Richmond. We used some really cutting edge communications tools to, first of all, help remind everybody that we all have an interest in safe communities. And then when there was an incident in a priority neighborhood, we would run very cutting edge communications on social media, on gaming channels, to try to really get into the community and say, hey, wait a minute, before you run over and retaliate because of something that you've seen or heard, take a minute and think, is that really going to help things or only make it worse? And over that 9-month period, homicides were down by 50%, and violent crime down 30% overall. So, I'm really pleased to see that that new funding is going to be made available, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that Virginia takes advantage of that. Well, Pastor Harris, is the issue of gun violence something that is discussed in your congregation and in the faith communities? Obviously, it is when there's, as you said, when there are times when you have to minister in a tragedy. But is it something that is regularly discussed within the faith communities here in Richmond?
Yeah, I would say yes. And let me say this: as a Black preacher, you probably cannot not talk about it. I myself have had cousins killed from gun violence. Family members killed from family members who committed gun violence. So I mean, it's something like, yeah, I'm a pastor, but I'm also a Black man, right? So it's something that you cannot really get around in your pulpits. It's definitely impacting everybody. So yes, we talk about policy, we talk about laws, we talk about community responsibility. And let me say this about Carol in the RPD. Remember the time when the homicide rate was 160 in Richmond and it went down to 60? They did that pretty much without policy in their favor. Imagine if you would have had policy in their favor in addition to what the community policing that they did in that scenario. And everyone wants to huff and puff about how bad the police are, but the reality is they're not from Richmond half of the time. So they don't know the trajectory of the area, and a lot of things were working. And having relationships, getting to root causes works. It definitely works. She mentioned like females are more likely to be killed by somebody they were in relationship with than a stranger. So these things that you have to really get to the root causes. And even as the preacher, you have to watch what you preach and be responsible. We teach things like the man is the head of the household, but what does that mean? Does that mean if your wife goes somewhere, you smack her and beat her up? But the same people you say, well, slaves obey your masters, is also in the Bible. If someone rapes your daughter, they're supposed to marry her. That's also in the Bible. What are you teaching and how are you teaching it? What's your degree of being informed theologically? you got to be responsible for what you teach, because what you teach involves people's psyche. And if you're preaching this gospel of domination and control, it's not only is it not Christ, it's demonic. So we have to really be careful about what we are teaching in the communities, getting to root causes. And as the minister, we have to educate ourselves about what's going on. We can't say no woman is being abused in my church. I mean, are you kidding me? There are no gangs in my, are you kidding me? So we have to be informed about what's going on and getting to the root causes. That child you ignore right now, he may end up in, like Carol mentioned, what trauma these kids seeing. I've been in households where a fight is taking place between a girlfriend and a boyfriend. The kids are right there. Mom cut the boyfriend, bleeding. And the kids are expected to go to school the very next day. And you wonder why they don't perform well. So again, we have to get to the root of these causes. And so your question is, because preachers give a long answer. Yes, we talk about this. We talk about this all the time. And we really, it's something that we constantly are passionate about alleviating. 10 homicides is 10 homicides too many.
If I may jump in there, the fact of the matter is gun violence is a civil rights issue. And I think that every member of this panel would agree about the solutions that we want to see enacted. We agree on the resources that should be used and expended and invested in our communities. But we should also take a moment to think about the opposition to the solutions that we want to see happen. And that opposition is rooted in white supremacy. They don't want to give the money because they think the money benefits communities of color. They don't want the laws to be put into place because they think that it takes away their power to be armed and to be forceful and to, basically be supreme in our society. So these things we all have to consider. This is a civil rights issue. This is a white supremacy issue. And to really get a handle on our gun violence problem, we have to fight not just gun violence in and of itself, but also the explosive combination of gun violence with civil rights and with racism.
You're here.
You're here. I couldn't agree more, Gloria. It's just, we're arming hate. We're arming it, and we continue to arm it. And it is incumbent upon us to look at the persons who are at risk of committing violence. There's a researcher out of Duke, and angry white men are a risk category. And I don't think that surprises anybody on this panel. So thank you for your comments, because I agree wholeheartedly in our approach and our, perspective. It is not one thing. It is not the other thing. It's not the other thing. It is an entire continuum of getting at the root causes of violence, providing services and resources, looking at our policy, what works, what doesn't, what are the laws we need, and all of the above approach is absolutely necessary. And just one last comment, we've been able to get some trauma-informed funding for school counselors in the Commonwealth in the budget last year. I hope we can do it again. I think it is critical, absolutely critical, to get trauma-informed services to our youth who are either exposed to violence, witness violence, or perhaps a victim themselves. I think that is just critical to interrupting that cycle.
Well, we're starting to bump up against our hour. Does anybody else, would any of you like to offer some closing comments?
Just one, and it goes back to what I said earlier. I'm just afraid that the biggest obstacle we have to realizing any progress and to continue the progress, the biggest obstacle is the Republican Party. That's just, they are the party of white supremacy. That's what they've become. And we got to make sure that we prevail.
Anyone else? Carol? Major Cochran?
Well,
All right.
I would say in closing, control the narrative, because people lie. So I've seen laws voted down that finally passed that said you lose your gun rights for 14 days if you're suicidal or deemed a threat to yourself or someone else. And then that was translated into, oh, they're taking our guns. They're gonna come into your house and take your guns. People lie. So we have to be diligent about getting the right information out there and just being honest. But a lot of people just aren't honest with, well, I'll stop right there.
Right.
They're called Republicans.
Yeah, but that goes with, even though we have the big picture, the small picture is boots on the ground, engaging the communities so that we can properly educate and properly have an impact. And so we have to be the catalyst to move the work, because regardless of what's going on out there in the atmosphere, we're still losing individuals, their precious lives each and every day. So there are several components to the work. And so those of us that are boots on the ground has to continue that effort, because we have to save as many as we can, as soon as we can. And this work is continuous.
Well, I think, Shannon.
Well, and that was just, and for Attorney General Herring, this is not lost on you. I mean, this is an issue. While I know that we've got a lot of people from Northern Virginia and Central Virginia here, I mean, this is, and of course with Andy being down there in Southwest Virginia, I mean, this is the message for the entire Commonwealth. And to what Carol said, it is boots on the ground, because there might be people who are involved in these, Republican circles, but they actually get it. They're just too scared to speak out in certain environments. But we know that there are people who understand what the safety of their communities is all about. So I know that we can get the right message to the right people. And I did want to say that, Gloria, you did an awesome job following up on Pastor Harris, because you're a good preacher too. That was an awesome message. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, let me take a moment and thank all of you on the panel. This is such an important issue for our entire Commonwealth and our country. We have a gun violence problem in our nation and in Virginia. And thank you all for contributing to solutions and to this panel. And to everyone, I'd like to say thank you for joining on the program here, and thank you for watching. And we will continue our work. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye.